The Japanese have an art form called Kitsugi. And Kitsugi is the repair of broken pottery and ceramics using gold. Kitsugi literally means golden joinery. And many times, after these pieces of ceramics or pottery are put back together, they are more beautiful and more valuable than they were to start with. Here are some examples up on the screen of Kitsugi. Part of what makes the pieces beautiful is that no two are identical. Because no two pieces of ceramics or pottery break exactly the same. This morning, we want to take a look at the restoration and repair of Peter, who was a broken man after denying Christ 3 times. Sometimes when we sin, it's like we're walking along and we step in a hole and we fall down. And we're kind of embarrassed, so we spring right back up and we brush ourselves off and we keep walking. And that's the way it is sometimes with our sin. We fall, but we immediately recognize that we've sinned, and so we quickly cry out to God for forgiveness and we fall right back in step with Him. But then there are other times when we sin and it's like stepping off a cliff. And on the way down, we get bruised and we get bloody. And we find ourselves lying at the bottom thinking to ourselves, how did I ever get here? And the way back up is not easy, but it is possible. Jesus and his disciples had been in the upper room. Jesus had washed their feet. They had celebrated Passover together. And Jesus told his disciples that he was going to be betrayed, arrested, and crucified. And he said that all of the disciples would scatter. All of the disciples would run away. But Peter said to him, no, not me, Jesus, not me. They might, but I won't. No matter what it takes, no matter what it costs, I will not deny you. I will not betray you. Even if I have to die, I will die with you, Jesus. And I think, like Peter, so often we overestimate our strength. And we overestimate our love for the Lord. And so sometimes when we sin, like Peter, we feel utterly defeated and we wonder, is God done with us? Does he want nothing more to do with us? And this passage we're going to look at this morning, the restoration of Peter, assures us that restoration is possible. And so we see here that God is not done with us, but we can be picked up and we can get back walking with the Lord. There are 3 things that I want us to see in this chapter about restoration. So first, let's just start reading. Afterward, it says, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire and burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So Peter and some of the other disciples are out in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and they've been fishing all night and haven't caught anything. And they're about to make their way back to shore when all of a sudden they notice there's this individual standing on the beach. And he shouts out to them, "Throw your nets to the right side of the boat and you'll catch some fish." And maybe they thought he was able to see something in the water that they couldn't see, or maybe they just figured, what do we have to lose? So they threw the net on the right side of the boat, and it says that the net was so full that they couldn't get the net into the boat. And with that, they recognize this person standing on the beach yelling out to us, it's Jesus. And with that realization, Peter jumps into the water to make his way to Jesus as quickly as possible. And the question this makes me ask is, why did Jesus appear to them in this way? Why did Jesus come to them like this? He could have just stood there on the beach and waved his arms and said, "Hey guys, it's Jesus, come on in." Or he could have walked on water out to them. So why like this? At the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, it says that Jesus was teaching a crowd on the beach, possibly very close to the same spot. And Luke 5 says that the crowds were pressing in on Jesus, and Jesus looked and he saw some men by a couple of fishing boats, and he said, "Take me out onto the water." And so they did. And when he was done with his teaching, he said to these fishermen, including Peter, he said, "Let's go out into the deep water and you'll catch a bunch of fish." And Peter said to him, "You don't understand. We've been fishing all night. We haven't caught anything. But fine. If that's what you want us to do, we'll go out into the deep water and let down our nets. We've got nothing to lose." And Luke 5 says that when they went out into the deep water and put their nets down, the nets became so full that the nets were breaking. And when Peter saw that, Peter fell down on his face in the bottom of that damp, stinky fishing boat, where there were fish and fish guts and wet nets, and he fell down on his face in front of Jesus, and he said, "Go away from me, for I am a sinful man." And Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, don't let your guilt drive you away from me. Let your guilt draw you to me. Amen. And now, commit yourself to me and join with me in completing my mission." And when they got back to shore, it says that they brought the boats up onto the beach, and they walked away from their boats, and they followed Jesus. And so why I think Jesus appears to them after his resurrection, here in John chapter 21 in this way, is because it forces Peter to remember that first miraculous catch of fish. It takes him back to thinking about when he first saw Jesus and heard Jesus, and when he fell before Jesus, and he walked away from the boats, and he committed himself to Christ. Because one of the first things that needs to happen when we're talking about restoration is we have to ask, was it real? When I first came to Jesus, was it real? Did I really mean it? Was it really a commitment? And so Jesus comes to them in this way in order to cause Peter to wonder, back then, was my commitment to Jesus real? A number of years ago, I had a young man come to me and he asked me, "Do you rebaptize people?" So I asked him, "Well, tell me your story." And his story was that he had been baptized as a child he said, to make his grandma happy. But he didn't really know or understand what he was doing. Now, we can have a debate whether or not that's really baptism or whether he just got wet being dunked in a tank in a church building. In my understanding, that isn't a baptism if it's not accompanied with true faith. But those were his terms. Those were his terms. And so later on, after having conversations, I baptized him. But it was him coming to Christ, not him being restored to Christ, because he had never come to Christ in the first place. But I have had many people share with me their stories of how they made a decision for Christ, how they were sincere in their commitment, how they understood the gospel, how they stepped out for Jesus. But since then, maybe they've drifted away from walking with Christ. Or maybe because of their sin and rebellion, they've made choices that have driven them away from Jesus. And they're like at the bottom of the cliff, looking up, asking themselves, how did I ever end up here? And now they want to get back to Jesus. They want to have that fresh, clean, alive feeling of continuing fellowship with Jesus. And the first thing that needs to happen is they need to go back and they need to determine, was it real? Was it real? Because if they never first came to Jesus, it's not a restoration. You can't have a marriage restored where the people were never married. You can't have a painting restored when there never was a painting. And so if they never first came to Christ, then it's not about restoration, it's about conversion. It's about them coming to Jesus initially. But if it was real, then it's about coming back. And its restoration. But let's keep reading. He says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now you'll notice on your outline, it says that there's an ugly and beautiful part of restoration. There are certain parts of being restored to Christ that are painful, that are ugly. But the end result is beautiful. For instance, notice here, this was public. This was public. This was not a private conversation that Jesus had with Peter. Peter is sitting there on the beach, surrounded by his peers. Now remember, the evening Jesus was betrayed and arrested, he said that all of the disciples would run away, and they all did. So Peter is not the only one guilty of acting in self-preservation, but Peter is the only one who confidently declared, I will never deny you, Jesus. And I'm sure Peter didn't enjoy being singled out by Jesus. I'm sure Peter didn't enjoy having all of the eyes of the other disciples glaring at him, but they all knew of his denial. All four Gospels tell the story of Peter denying Christ. And so sometimes restoration needs to be public because the sin is public. Now, we want to keep our sins secret. We don't want anybody to know. We know our failures. We feel our shame, but we don't want anybody else to know. And yet, perhaps that's an indication of us not really understanding the depth of our sin. Or that we're more concerned about our reputation in the eyes of others than being restored to Christ. And so sometimes restoration needs to be public. The second thing we see here It was repeated 3 times. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times. That seems kind of cruel. That's kind of like picking at the scab, isn't it? Why 3 times? Well, because Peter had denied Christ 3 times. And so Jesus is making sure that Peter and everyone else knows that Peter is completely forgiven. James Montgomery Boyce shared about a restoration service for a minister who had fallen. This minister had been guilty of committing adultery, and he was removed from his church, and he was removed from the ministry. But in that denomination, they had a team of people who came around him and around his family and ministered to them and discipled them and served them and helped them. And after a number of years of exemplary living, it was decided that this man would be restored to the ministry. And so James Montgomery Boyce was in this service of restoration. And he said that it was painful, that it was difficult. Part of the service was this minister was told to get up and confess what he had done. And Boyce said it wasn't uncomfortable for the minister, but it was uncomfortable for all the rest of us. In fact, Boyce said that there were times in the service where he wanted to jump up and say, "Stop! Let's just put an end to this. Why can't this be done in private? It's too embarrassing. It's too shameful." And after the service, Boyce realized that it had been handled correctly. Because if it had been done privately and secretly, there still would have been people with doubts and questions. And this way, everyone knew that this man had truly repented and understood the depth of his sin. And so, this needed to be repeated 3 times because what Jesus was doing, not only for Peter, but for everyone else, he was openly declaring that these sins are forgiven. This chapter in Peter's life is closed. Now he's going to move on with Jesus. Third thing we see here, the critical question in restoration is the question of love. Jesus doesn't ask Peter, "Are you sorry for what you did?" He doesn't ask him, "Do you regret what you did?" He asks him, "Do you love me?" Because the critical question in restoration is, do you love Jesus? We only have one word for love. But in New Testament Greek, they had several. And the first question Jesus poses to Peter is this: "Peter, do you love me?" And he uses the word agape. "Peter, do you agape me?" And it means a self-sacrificing kind of love. Now, remember what Peter was guilty of. He had said, "Even though everybody else fails, I will never fail you. Even if I have to die, I will die with you, Jesus." And so Jesus asks him, "Do you really have this kind of self-sacrificing love for me?" And Peter answers and he says, "Lord, I phileo you." It's another word for love. It's a deep love, but it's not a self-sacrificing love. And in saying that, Peter has come to the point where he understands that he's not necessarily stronger than anybody else. That he doesn't love Jesus more than others love Jesus. And that when push came to shove and he had the opportunity to die for Christ, he wasn't willing to. So Jesus asks him again, "Peter, do you agape me?" And again, Peter says, "I phileo you." And the third time, Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, do you really phileo me? Do you really love me?" And Peter says, "Lord, you know all things. And yes, I love you. I won't say that my love is stronger than others. I won't say that I love you more deeply than others, but this is what I will say. I truly love you." And Jesus doesn't expect perfect love from broken people. But he wants to know that we love him. In order to be restored, we must love him. If there is no love, there can be no restoration. But if there is love, he will forgive us and welcome us back. And then true restoration leads to service. Each time Jesus asks Peter a question, his response is, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, Peter had been a leader, but he had a great fall. And if Jesus had said to Peter, you know, Peter, I forgive you for what you've done, but I can't use you anymore. You've got to go sit on the shelf over there. Some of us would have understood that. But that's not what Jesus did. That's not what Jesus did. He forgave Peter. And he said to Peter, when Peter fell on his face in the bottom of that fishing boat, Jesus said to Peter, you're going to become a fisher of men. What Jesus says to Peter here is he says, you're going to become a teacher to the fish who have been caught. He says, you're going to become the shepherd of my sheep. And one of the clearest indications that true restoration has happened is that the restored person is not going to be content sitting on the sidelines. They're going to want their life to make a difference in the cause of Christ. And so when it comes to restoration, there are some painful and ugly parts. But the final result is beautiful. Well, one more thing for us to see. Keep reading. So it says, this is verse 18. Very truly, this is Jesus speaking. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So Jesus says to Peter here, he says, Peter, when you were young, you went where you wanted to go. You did what you wanted to do. But a day is coming when you will be captured and your hands will be stretched out. And John gives us the commentary. He says, Jesus said this to indicate how Peter would die. At the close of Peter's letters in the New Testament, there are indications that Peter is in the city of Rome, and he gives indication that he is about to be put to death. And tradition says that Peter was arrested under Nero, and he was sentenced to execution, that he was sentenced to death. And they made preparations to crucify Peter, but Peter did not consider himself worthy of dying the way Jesus had died. And so they nailed Peter to the cross upside down. They crucified Peter upside down. But this is what I want us to see here. What was it that had been Peter's downfall? Peter's downfall was that when push came to shove, he denied knowing Christ and he denied following Christ in order to save his own life. And what Jesus is saying here to Peter is, Peter, you're going to get that opportunity again. You're going to get the same opportunity because you're going to be arrested and they're going to ask, are you a follower of Jesus? If so, it means the cross for you. And Jesus tells Peter here, he says, Peter, this time, you're going to be faithful. And the lesson here for those of us who have been restored is be ready. Be ready. Because the very temptation that caused you to deny Christ in the past is a temptation that will come at you again. Because once Satan gets you to deny Christ, he sees that as a vulnerability in you. And he will hit that over and over and over again, hoping that you will deny Christ again. So be ready for it. Be ready. In John chapter 21, it is this amazing story of Peter's restoration. Now, we can't restore ourselves. Christ restores us. And it is his grace given to us. And maybe you know someone who needs to be restored. Share with them the things that we've seen today. Or maybe you're the person who needs to be restored. Maybe you're the person who has drifted away from Christ. Or maybe you've taken a step off a cliff and you find yourself at the bottom of the cliff wondering, how did I ever end up here? This restoration of Peter should be a great encouragement to you. Because it lets us know that restoration is possible. And it lets us know that Jesus is standing on the shore of your life, inviting you to come back to him. And when you do, Jesus will heal you. Jesus will fix you. He will repair you. He will restore you. So that your testimony is beautiful and your walk with Christ is even more precious.